What's up, Jeez Louise? Good evening. How goes it? They managed to transition from green energy to fossil fuels. It's a pretty good meme. Let me see real quick. Hold on a second. I don't think they really... You're being a little bit dramatic. What up, Jay? Okay. Thanks for checking in. Cheers. You're being a little bit over the top when you say Germany transitioned to fossil fuels, because if we look, let's see. Let's look at their graph. Let's not do them dirty. Hey, thanks for the sub. Thanks for the prime sub. TTV. Appreciate it. All right. Didn't I have a graph in one of my PowerPoints about this that I had pulled this up recently? Let me see. So let's go to, I think EIA is a good site for this. Although EIA sometimes isn't the best. Germany is blocking shipment of weapons to Ukraine because they need oil imports from Russia to meet demands. The transition is complete. I'll be honest with you, Jeez Louise and Willy Wonka, you're both talking about Ukraine. I am kind of out of the loop on the whole Ukraine sitch. Yeah, like global politics and like international relations is definitely not my strong suit. So I wouldn't feel comfortable even offering up a thought that would be so uninformed. I feel like it's something that you have to know a lot about to feel like you have any sort of informed opinion. My guess is that there's probably a lot of details, but at the same time, there's probably a lot that we can't really know because we're talking about like probably a lot of like backdoor or behind the scenes political agendas between countries and like power struggles. It's tough. I don't know. I hope nothing crazy happens because that's all I could say. Should we catch up? Should we learn a little bit about the Ukraine-Russia situation? Do some research today about that? Could do it. Let's see. Ukraine and Russia. Let's see. What is a good way to catch up? Let's do this. Let me share my window here so we can see what we're doing. Whoa. Fox News. I was also trying to do a little research on NFTs. So this is just something, let's just get the basics from Al Jazeera. 5 things to know. Why are Ukraine's NATO ambitions so controversial? And could an all-out war break out? It's critical questions. Let's see. Actually, why don't we do this? Why don't we go... Why don't we do this? set the scene up this way. I think it's going to be a little better. Y'all don't need to see my face so big. We can just keep it. Okay. There we go. Okay. So NATO, if we remember, is the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. It's an intergovernmental military alliance between 27 European countries, 2 North American, 1 Eurasian. So NATO, if I remember correctly, NATO is kind of like, it's a collective, but I feel like the US is sort of like the big boys in charge of NATO. Like they're the ones that kind of have a lot of the power there. So is Ukraine part of NATO? Hold on. No, the Ukraine is not part of NATO. So NATO allies, fearful of a potential ground invasion by Russia, have stepped up support for Kiev by sending additional troops and military equipment to Ukraine. Kiev, is that like the capital of Ukraine? Yes. Okay. So the alliance says its move is in response to Russia's continued military buildup along the Ukraine border. All right. So what's Moscow's side? Moscow claims its actions are necessary to secure vital security interests and blames NATO for undermining the region's security. Here are 5 things you should know. Why is there conflict? So the Ukraine, which is part of the Russian Empire for centuries, before becoming a Soviet republic, won independence as the USSR broke up in 1991. It moved to shed its Russian imperial legacy and forge increasingly close ties with the West. Okay, so that's already going to have some issues, right? So if the Ukraine was formerly part of the Russian Empire and then sort of moved to become more like the West, which is sort of in opposition to Russia, as Russia's typically considered like antithetical to the quote-unquote West, Russia's probably not so happy with the direction that the Ukraine has moved, maybe thinking that they are... And I'm pretty sure that Ukraine has historically been, if I remember my history well, Ukraine has been a place that Russia has historically been invaded through, if I recall. So maybe they're worried about the Ukraine being, I don't know. I doubt anyone's going to invade Russia. It's never gone well for anybody. Let's see. A decision by the Kremlin-leaning Ukrainian president. The Kremlin-leaning Ukrainian president. Okay, so this is a president that, when we say Kremlin-leaning, what they mean, I'm assuming, is that they're sort of friendly or amenable to Russia. To reject an association agreement with the European Union in favor of closer ties with Moscow led to mass protests that saw him removed as leader in 2014. Russia responded by annexing Ukraine's Crimean Peninsula and throwing its weight behind a separatist rebellion that broke out in Ukraine's east. Okay. So what we have is a situation, seemingly, that the Ukraine itself probably has inner conflict amongst its own population and like the political parties in the Ukraine as to whether or not the Ukraine should align itself more with NATO and the West, or if the Ukraine should align itself more with Russia. And so it seems that Russia will probably have some involvement in supporting any rebellion or like civil unrest that would lead the country of Ukraine to becoming more amenable to Russia. So Ukraine and the West accused Russia of sending its troops and weapons to back the rebels. Moscow denied that, saying the Russians who joined were volunteers. Okay, so again, this is, we can't really know, right? There's going to be a lot of obfuscating the truth here, right? So like the West will say the troops that these people were sent by the Russian government, and then Russia will deny it and be like, no, we didn't send them, they were just volunteers. According to Kiev, more than 14,000 people have died in the fighting that devastated Donbass, Ukraine's eastern industrial heartland. Interesting. Okay, so it's the conflict areas right here on the border. What's up, Evian? You spent 11 years of your life in Ukraine, and you remember finding out how it all started as a riot and then grew into an 8-year-old conflict. It was terrifying. I can't imagine. I mean, luckily for me, I've lived my entire life in the United States. And the United States is, we're so isolated from a lot of the conflict in the world that we don't really, it's not really on our, like on our back door, or like it is in some other parts of the world. Okay, so for its part, Moscow has strongly criticized the U.S. and its NATO allies for providing Ukraine with weapons and holding joint drills, saying that such moves encourages Ukrainian hawks to try to regain the rebel-held areas by force. Furthermore, Russian President Vladimir Putin has repeatedly said Ukraine's aspirations to join NATO are a red line, and expressed concern about plans by some NATO members to set up military training centers in Ukraine. This, he has said, would give them a military foothold in the region, even without Ukraine joining NATO. Okay, so it sounds to me like it's a struggle. Ukraine is sort of caught in the middle of this struggle between NATO and the West and Russia itself. I get the sense that Ukraine seems to be more partial to the West, considering the fact that they overthrew this Viktor Yanukovych guy, who was a Kremlin-leaning president. They overthrew him and removed him. You lived 100 kilometers away from the conflict? Wow. That's crazy. What does Russia want? It's more about what Russia doesn't want. Russia does not want Ukraine in NATO, and has said as much in its list of security demands, which were sent to the U.S. last December. Interesting. So Russia's demanding that the Ukraine be barred from joining NATO. What are their other demands? Is there like a list? I don't know. We don't need to read this one. Moscow is still waiting for a response, but many of its ultimatums have been slammed as non-starters by the West. It also wants NATO to withdraw from Eastern Europe. Oh, wow. So the question would be, the deeper question here is like, why does Russia not want Ukraine in NATO? Is it just because it's like encroaching, like the more countries in Eastern Europe that join NATO, the more of like the less Russia can expand? Is it that? Or do they feel like they're being encroached? At the time, Putin said Russia would seek guarantees that would exclude any further NATO moves eastward and the deployment of weapon systems that threatens us in close vicinity to Russian territory. Putin offered the West an opportunity to engage in substantive talks on the issue, adding that Moscow would need not just verbal assurance, but legal guarantees. Ukraine's admission to the alliance would require the unanimous approval of 30 states to make up the body. Will Ukraine join NATO? Ukraine is not a NATO member, but it wants to be. It is considered a partner of the alliance. Before being considered for membership, NATO says Kiev needs to root out scourges such as corruption. NATO Security General Jens Stoltenberg in December rejected Russian demands to rescind a 2008 commitment to Ukraine that the country would one day become a member. Stoltenberg maintains that when the time comes to consider the issue, Russia will not be able to veto Ukraine's accession. Well, why would Russia be able to veto it? If Russia is not part of NATO, how can they even have a vote? Or even how do they even have veto power if they're not part of the group? It seems like they wouldn't be able to say anything at all. Analysts, however, say that NATO allies, the United States chief among them, are reluctant to expand their military footprint in the region and further jeopardize their relationship with Moscow. While the U.S. Secretary of State Anthony Blinken has voiced support for Ukraine's membership, President Biden has been more ambiguous on the question. Will there be an all-out war? The West is accusing Russia, which has amassed 100,000 troops on the Ukrainian border, of preparing to invade its pro-Western neighbor. Biden claims total unanimity on how to deal with Russia. So total unanimity. What does this mean again? Agreement by all people involved. Okay. So everyone agrees on how to deal with it? But how? What are you going to do? The Pentagon has put 8,500 U.S. troops on standby for an Eastern European deployment, and NATO said it was sending ships and jets to bolster the region's defenses. Putin spokesman Dmitry Peskov said these actions only added to an already tense atmosphere. The United States is escalating tensions, he told reporters. We are watching these U.S. actions with great concern. Russia denies it has any plans to invade the Ukraine and accuses the West of aggravating the situation. It is uncertain whether war will break out between the two countries, but some analysts say Russia could move in on the Ukraine to claim a quick and decisive victory and increase its bargaining power in future talks about NATO's expansion and spheres of influence. I think what Russia and Vladimir Putin will really be after would be to defeat the Ukrainian armed forces in the field, inflicting a crushing military defeat that humiliates the Ukrainians and by extension create concern that the backing Ukraine has from its allies in the West, the US and the UK is insufficient. What happens if Russia invades? Western nations have thrown their support behind the Ukraine, but some responses have been tougher than others. The U.S. and U.K. have supplied weapons, while Germany plans to send a field medical facility next month, but will not transfer military equipment. There has also been much talk of sanctions aimed at punishing Moscow. Publicly, the U.S. and European allies have promised to hit Russia financially like never before if Putin does roll his military into Ukraine. Leaders have given a few details, however, arguing it is best to keep Putin guessing. Cutting Russia out of the SWIFT financial system, which moves money from bank to bank around the globe, would be one of the toughest financial steps they could take, damaging Russia's economy and in the long run. SWIFT financial system. This would be like sanctioning. SWIFT for electronic funds. Behind most international money and security transfers is the Society for Worldwide Interbank Financial Telecommunications, a vast messaging network and used by banks and other financial institutions to quickly, accurately, and securely send and receive information such as money transfer instructions. Okay. So if Russia can't access this, that kind of impacts their economy because probably wouldn't allow people to do business as easily with the rest of the world. Yeah, makes sense. The move could cut Russia off from most international financial transactions, including international profits from oil and gas production, which accounts for more than 40% of the country's revenue. The U.S. also holds one of the most powerful financial weapons against Putin if he invades Ukraine, blocking Russia from access to the U.S. dollar. Dollars still dominate in financial transactions around the world, with trillions of dollars in play daily. Finally, the U.S. is considering imposing export controls, potentially cutting Russia off from the high-tech that, among other things, helps warplanes and passenger jets fly and power smartphones. So this gives us a little bit of an overview, but I think there's probably a lot more going on that relies on a deeper understanding of history, and I wonder what the Russian perspective would be on this as well. So Al Jazeera, let's look up Al Jazeera. Like, what's their political leanings? Al Jazeera, political bias check. There's a website that does this political bias check. Media fact check. Which is the website that I've used before? Is it this one? Let me just double check if this is the one I'm thinking about. Yeah, this one, media bias fact check. So Al Jazeera, they say in their analysis, is left of center and their factual reporting is mixed. Interesting. So these media sources have a slight to moderate liberal bias. They often publish factual information that utilizes loaded words, wording that attempts to influence an audience by using an appeal to emotion or stereotype to favor liberal causes. Overall, we rate Al Jazeera left-center biased based on story selection that slightly favors the left, and mixed for factual reporting due to failed fact checks that were not corrected and misleading extreme editorial bias that favors Qatar. Okay. Interesting, that favors Qatar. So Al Jazeera is out of Qatar, right? Qatar. Okay. Let's look up any other interesting stuff that we can read about. We have CNN. Maybe BBC sometimes is pretty good. Although you have to remember, there's always going to be bias, right? So if you're reading a source, like BBC is from Britain, which is part of NATO. So there's probably a West biased here. Where Russia's troops are positioned. Crimea. This is where a lot of stuff goes down. A little bit over here. What does Russia want from NATO? Basically, Russia is absolutely mandatory to ensure Ukraine never, ever becomes a member of NATO. So my guess that is what's going on here is the West, including the US and other NATO countries, are probably weighing, is it worth including Ukraine in NATO, knowing that Russia might go absolutely mental if they do, or just might go off the rails. What up, Arcane? So, okay, here's another thing. Okay, let's put our Russian hat on. What are those? What are the hats they wear in Russia? Let's put that on for a second and take Russia's perspective on this, especially with this map. So if you're Russia and let's say you're afraid that you're being globally teamed up against by the West, including the United States and European Union. And what you're worried about is that they're going to continue to expand power and influence further and further east towards your country of Russia. If you look at this map, looks maybe justifiable, right? If you're Russia, so since 1997, which is, we're talking like 20, 25 years, look at all of the countries that have joined NATO. And now look, if Ukraine joins, I can see, if you're just strictly from a Russian perspective, I can understand why Russia would not want Ukraine to join NATO if we're really. So I guess the other question is is it really this the West versus Russia situation at a global, is that the global clash that's happening? Because if that's the case, and then the question is well, why is that the case? Why is Russia and the West, why are they at odds? And maybe it's because it's just they're the biggest powers that are colliding. Russia seized Crimea in 2014, arguing it had a historic claim to it. Ukraine was part of the Soviet Union, which collapsed in December 1991, and Mr. Putin said it was the disintegration of historical Russia. A clue to President Putin's thinking on Ukraine came in a lengthy piece last year when he called Russians and Ukrainians one nation. He labeled Ukraine's current leaders as running an anti-Russian project. The question is how far Russia will go. President Biden has warned that a full-scale invasion would be a disaster for Russia. But if it was a minor incursion, he said, controversially, that the West would end up having to fight about what to do. The White House has stressed any move across the border constitutes a renewed invasion, but points out Russia has other weapons, including cyber attacks and paramilitary tactics. The Pentagon has accused Russia of preparing a so-called false flag operation, with operatives ready to carry out acts of sabotage against Russian-backed rebels to provide a pretext for invasion. Russia has denied it. However, if Russia's only aim is to force NATO away from its backyard, there is no sign of its succeeding. NATO's 30 members have turned down flat any attempt to tie their hands for the future. We will not allow anyone to slam close NATO's open door policy. Ukraine is looking for a clear timeline to join, and NATO says Russia has no veto, no right to interfere in that process. And non-NATO members, Sweden and Finland, have also rejected Russia's attempt to stop them beefing up their ties with the alliance. We will not let go of our room for maneuver. How far will the West go for Ukraine? The U.S. has made it clear it has no plans to send combat troops to the Ukraine itself, while being committed to helping the country defend its sovereign territory. The main tools in the West's armory appears to be sanctions and military aid in the form of advisors and weapons. I think my guess is sanctions are probably the big one. If they can cut Russia off from the global financial market and the U.S. dollar, I don't see how Russia could. It seems pretty tough. President Biden has threatened threatens those regions with measures like none he's ever seen if the Ukraine is attacked. So what would that involve? The ultimate economic hit would be to disconnect Russia's banking system from the international SWIFT payment system. That has always been seen as very much a last resort, and there is concern it could badly impact the U.S. and European economies. So I guess the reason why it would badly impact our economies is because Russia supplies Russia's a large enough country that if you remove their consumer base and their economy from the global economy, it does damper everybody else as well. But I feel like Russia would get hit way harder than the rest. What is Russia's, it's got to be oil, right? Mainly exports hydrocarbons. I want to do like Russian economy. How do I phrase this? So in 2019, it exported $407 billion worth of products and imported $238 billion. So if you cut Russia off from the SWIFT financial banking system, you're essentially severing a big chunk of exports and imports. Economic complexity, 0.58. This section shows exports, imports, and economic complexity data. Russia has a high level of specialization in nuclear reactors, pig iron, raw nickel, and semi-finished iron. So they have a lot of iron production and nuclear production. Interesting. $2.2 billion of iron ore exports. Dang. That's crazy. Hmm. Okay, I need to figure out what this means. Economic complexity ranking. Japan is ranked number 1 in economic complexity. US is number 9. Oh, China. Oh, US is 10 now. What is economic complexity? The Economic Complexity Index and the Product Complexity Index are respectively measures of the relative knowledge intensity of an economy or a product. What does that even mean? A holistic measure of the productive capabilities of large economic systems, usually cities, regions, or countries. In particular, the ECI looks to explain the knowledge accumulated in a population, and that is expressed in economic activities present in a city, country, or region. To achieve this goal, the ECI defines the knowledge available in a location as the average knowledge of the activities present in it, and the knowledge of an activity as the average knowledge of the places where the economic activity is conducted. Bro, what does that sentence even mean? I feel like it used the word knowledge 20 times. Okay, the ECI defines the knowledge available in a location as the average knowledge of the activities present in it, and the knowledge of an activity as the average knowledge of the places where that economic activity is conducted. What? I have never heard of something so complex. ECI is not only as a descriptive measure, but as a predictive tool for economic growth and income inequality. According to the statistics models presented in their Atlas of Economic Complexity, the ECI is a more accurate predictor of GDP per capita growth than traditional measures of governance, competitiveness, and human capital. ECI also shows a strong negative correlation with income inequality, suggesting that more knowledge-intense productive structures are more inclusive in terms of income distribution and providing a statistically more powerful explanation of cross-national variations in income inequality than Kuznets curve. Okay, so Japan has just been number 1 in this by far for a while. The US sits at number 11. And then Russia, where's Russia at? Wow, Russia's not... Did I miss them? No way. Russia can't be that far down, can they? Wow, 64th. Interesting. Hmm. Yeah, I don't know. Seems like it's a pretty. I mean, I guess at the end of the day, like, is this just sort of posturing back and forth between Russia and the West? Or is there any real threat here of something going down? I don't know if we actually know the answer because we don't really know what's going on in the minds of either side or in the collective minds of either side. Let's watch this.
Ukraine.
What up, Mr. Chang? All right. I'm trying to learn a little bit about this Ukraine, Russian, NATO sitch.
Ukraine is a flashpoint of tension between Russia and the West. Since the Euromaidan revolution of 2014, fighting with Russian-backed separatists in the east of the country has killed over 13,000 people. The Crimean Peninsula has been occupied and unilaterally annexed. And with Russian troops building up at the Ukrainian border, we can ask, how did we get here? And what does Ukraine mean to Russia? Ukraine is very important to Russia. They trace their common history back nearly 1,000 years to the Kingdom of Kievan Rus. Its capital, Kiev, still goes by the nickname of Mother of Russian Cities. And for many Russians, including the Russian President Vladimir Putin, Ukraine is part of what he calls historic Russia. And Ukrainians and Russians are one and the same people.
Okay, so the question is Is that really the reason why Russia wants Ukraine? Is it really this sort of historical sort of homeland slash... There's got to be more to it, right? There's got to be more.
Roughly 30% of Ukrainians, mostly in the east of the country, speak Russian as a first language, and 15% of the population considers themselves to be ethnically Russian. And if we consider the borders of both the Russian Empire and the Soviet Union, in the past 300 years, Ukraine and Russia were part of the same country. And throughout that time, it was of strategic importance. Alongside Belarus, it served as a buffer for invasion, like during the Napoleonic Wars and the two World Wars. The port of Sevastopol in Crimea has been Russia's main warm sea water port. And after being part of the same country for so long, Ukraine was an important industrial base for weaponry. But that was until the Soviet Union broke apart in 1991. Bankrupted by its military operation in Afghanistan, the Chernobyl nuclear disaster, and an inefficient economy, it fell apart after attempts at reform in the 1990s, with nationalist movements across the Union declaring independence. This was the fall of historic Russia.
The red flag came down over the Kremlin tonight as President Gorbachev resigned and brought to an end 7 decades of communist rule in the Soviet Union.
15 independent states which share only a disastrous economy and an uncertain future.
The Soviet Union lost its puppet states of the Warsaw Pact, and with the 15 Soviet republics gaining their independence, Russia lost Ukraine. In the space of 2 years, the map of Eastern Europe went from looking like this to this. In the aftermath, Russia and the other former Soviet republics signed divorce bills to normalize relations and facilitate trade. And in the case of Ukraine, this meant handing over 4,000 nuclear weapons in exchange for guarantees to its borders and sovereignty. The fall of the Soviet Union would also lead to new relations between Russia and the West, but these relations deteriorated from what Russia saw as Western advancement in its sphere of influence. When we look at changes to the map since the end of the Cold War, NATO went from looking like this to this, reducing the strategic buffer that Russia had from more than 2,000 kilometers to less than 1,000. For Russia, this was the breaking of what they say was a promise by the West to leave Russia its sphere of influence.
Прежде всего, конечно, Соединенных Штатов, перешагнула свои национальные границы и, по сути, во всех сферах. Получается, что НАТО выдвигает свои передовые силы к нашим государственным границам. И что стало с теми заверениями, которые давались западными партнерами после распуска Варшавского договора?
It's a promise the US and NATO deny ever existed, but despite it having never been formalized, and Russia now exaggerating how it was formulated, it is clear that on some level there was the expectation that this would be the case. And that is where Ukraine enters the discussion. After the fall of the Soviet Union, it attempted to keep a balance between Russia and the West, avoiding integration with either. While many of the former states joined regional organizations led by Russia, Ukraine mostly stayed away. But the country was deeply corrupt and controlled by oligarchs. And following an election widely reported as rigged by Western observers in 2004, a large protest movement called the Orange Revolution took to the streets. In part due to Western support for the protesters, the election was rerun, and the reformist opposition led by Viktor Yushchenko won. This marked the beginning of a rapprochement between Ukraine and the West. The country was invited to become part of NATO in 2008, and it joined the EU's Eastern Partnership in 2009. But in 2010, the reformists who were damaged by political infighting between the president and the prime minister lost the election to Viktor Yanukovych. It's at that point that Ukraine had to decide either between closer ties with the EU or Russia. This led the two blocs to compete for influence in the country. Ukraine, which had signed an association agreement with the EU, broke it off to pursue an agreement with Russia. This triggered the Euromaidan protests. Pro-EU protesters asked for the deal with the European Union to be put back on track. After the government's violent crackdown, the protests turned into a revolution. And the protesters, who initially had the backing from EU leaders, went on to overthrow Yanukovych's government.
Few would have predicted the speed of events. Parliament voting President Viktor Yanukovych out of office.
It split the country and triggered backlash, mostly in the Russian east. These two revolutions angered Russia, who viewed them in the context of an expanding US sphere of influence in Eastern Europe. In response to Euromaidan, Russian troops invaded Crimea, securing the strategic port of Sevastopol.
Russia says it needs to defend the Crimean Peninsula from a potential attack by NATO. But that's not the only reason it has brought the big guns here. A year and a half after the annexation, the Kremlin started operations in Syria.
It hastily organized a referendum to justify annexing the peninsula, where 96% of people voted to join Russia. But with a large portion of Crimeans considering themselves to be Russian, the result would have likely been the same if it had been a legal one. Russia also backed separatists in the east of the country to destabilize Ukraine and prevent it from getting closer to the west. Ukraine's disorganized army relied on a series of militia groups, some with far-right leanings, to defend its border, and it led to a 7-year conflict, with civilians paying a heavy price by indiscriminate bombing. And while in 2015, both Russia and Ukraine settled on a peace agreement called Minsk II, which sought to find a political settlement and reunite Ukraine with the separatist provinces, it has mostly stalled, and eastern Ukraine has turned into a frozen conflict. In response, the European Union and the United States have imposed sanctions that have isolated and weakened the Russian economy. Those sanctions and the status of Ukraine continue to poison relations between Russia and the West. But in March 2021, Russia started deploying unprecedented amount of troops near the Ukrainian border. And while it wasn't the first time that Russia organized military exercises in the region, this time something had changed. So why after 7 years was the situation so different? The answer is Ukraine. Since 2014, its democracy has been consolidated, moving up in international rankings. The country has also grown more assertive towards Russia. In a series of controversial language laws since 2016, it has removed the Russian language from media, business, and education. Crimea, which is cut off from the mainland, faces severe water shortages. Ukraine's army has modernized with American anti-tank missiles and Turkish drones. And as Russia seeks to integrate those living in separatist regions, giving passports to those living there, Ukraine increasingly sees the Minsk II agreement as a potential Russian Trojan horse in its politics. And its improved military has sparked Russian fears that Ukraine could retake the separatist regions by force. In November 2021, Russia started moving even more troops to the border, prompting concerns of an invasion. And while both European and American leaders talked of raising the cost of intervening in Ukraine, they refused to intervene militarily. But Russia has made a series of demands going beyond Ukraine, asking for security guarantees that would effectively push NATO's border back.
Russian draft treaty between the United States of America and the Russian Federation. So this is the list of demands. This is a shortened version. This is the list of demands that Russia made. Not undermine security through participation in international organization or military alliances. To ensure that military alliances adhere to the United Nations Charter. To ensure that third countries' territories are not used to plan an attack or undermine the security interests of either Russia, U.S. or Russia. The U.S. shall view that there is no NATO expansions eastward and deny entry to former countries of the USSR. Okay, so they really just don't want, like, Ukraine to join NATO. The Russia and U.S. Federation will not deploy military forces or equipment in third countries. I'm not sure what this idea of third countries are. Refrain from flying heavy bombers or deploying surface warships outside their own borders. The parties will not deploy short and medium-range missiles, both inside or outside the territory. The parties shall refrain from deploying nuclear weapons outside the national territory. The treaty shall enter into force from the date of receipt of the last one. I think the reason why the NATO or the U.S. declined this was the fact of this one, the expansion, because they really want Ukraine.
And reestablish its buffer, turning back the clock to 1999. Western leaders view this as Russia attempting to reestablish its sphere of influence in Eastern Europe and in the former Soviet Union, like with the Russian interventions in Kazakhstan and Belarus. But with Russian troops at the border and the failure of negotiations, what comes next for a Ukraine that increasingly looks to the West remains uncertain.
Okay. I guess we will see how this thing unfolds. Whoa,
The
wait.
Cold War sort.
Wait, USSR asked to join NATO at one point? Interesting. What do you got for me, MC?
Yeah.
11 things you never want to hear a paramedic say. Is this a little comedic relief here? Could use a little comedic relief. The Russia-Ukraine thing is basically anti-comedy.
And that's how I finally managed to get my paramedic license back.
Oh man, I said you suck, not give him sucks.
Wait, did you say 2 milligrams or 0.2 milligrams? Bad news is you've lost a lot of blood. Good news is we found it. Did you catch Station 19's episode last night? That show is amazing. Nah, that can't be right. I've never seen a person with a blood pressure that low still be conscious. So on a scale of 1 to 10, how up to date is your will? How bad is it? I mean, what do you consider bad? What? Sir, how many fingers am I holding up? Okay, potato is not a number. Yeah, St. Mary's, this is Rescue 27. I need you to have everybody ready.
So is this somebody that's part of the fire department or paramedics? Because it's the YouTube channel is Fire Department Chronicles, but I see that it's an EMT. Is the so you say firefighter / paramedic? Is it are you technically both when you become a? It's like a dual role that you have. So most firefighters are also paramedics, but it's probably not the other way around, I would imagine. I feel like I would have actually, if I could go back, I think pursuing a career as a firefighter would have been something I could see myself of doing, having done. I think that would have been an interesting move. Actually, let's do this. mean, it makes sense considering the fact that firefighters are like oftentimes like first responders. So if you're a firefighter, you're obviously going to be rescuing people that are in need of some sort of medical care. So having your, you know, certification is probably what makes sense. Where am I going to do this? Over here. Main difference between an EMT and a paramedic is EMT is basic life support and paramedic is advanced. They're allowed to give drugs depending on the situation. Okay. Got it. Interesting. Didn't know that. I learned something new. I'm gonna be able to fit this on here. Willy Wonka, what's your what is your like wait who wait do I are you wait I think I don't know who you are. I feel like I knew you, but actually now I'm like second guessing myself. Oh, that's right. Okay. When you say we, I kept thinking you're not from Germany, are you? So this needs to go faster. Let's see what this is. Oh, I don't like that it does that on there.
You know, over the years, I've had a ton of you guys reach out to me asking me for tips on how to pass the hardest part of any hiring process. The drug screen. No, that was the interview. And to help you do as well as you possibly can on that wonderful interview process, I'm going to give you a few tips so you can finally become a part of the Band-Aid box riding, red truck driving brotherhood that we all love being in. Number one's pretty self-explanatory. Practice. Practice as much as possible. You have Google at your fingertips. Google as many interview questions as possible and then have the most intimidating people in your life ask you those questions. Do you have a friend that just likes to stare at you in a really weird way and not acknowledge anything that you're actually saying and you're trying to figure out what's going on in their head? Use that guy. That guy's perfect. Because most likely during the interview process, if you're spouting off the best information that you possibly can, the best reaction that you're going to get from somebody is one of these. And your job in that moment is to not take it personally, because it's not that they don't like you, and it's not that they don't like what you're saying, but their job in that moment is to write down as much information as possible so they can make sure that you get a fair hiring process. Number two, dress as well as possible. Look, we know not everyone owns a suit and tie. I mean, we are firefighters. 90% of us are so broke that trying to get $5 out of someone for dinner is like pulling teeth. But walk in there with the best possible clothes that you have. If all you have is a white V-neck shirt, a pair of scrubby jeans, and some boots, tuck your shirt in, wear a belt, and walk in that room with your head high and confidence. We know the difference between someone who is lazy and someone who utilizes the best tools that they have in their toolbox. Number three, command respect when you walk in the room. I'm not saying be disrespectful, but when you walk in that room, you look at every man and woman directly in the eyes and greet them. And then if you're allowed, you walk over to each and every one of them and shake their hand. And don't you dare dead fish somebody's hand. You firmly shake their hand, look them directly in the eyes, and let them know that you're there for business. And then quickly get back to your seat because you still have to be interviewed. Number four, be memorable in a good way. Remember, depending on the size of the agency or department that you're applying for, there may be 1,000 other applicants for one position. So you need to separate yourself from all 999 other people. And by answering questions with the minimal amount of information, you ain't gonna do that. If they ask you how to check out your SCBA, describe every single O-ring and connection in that system so they think, man, this guy knows what he's doing. And for the love of God, if they ask you why you want to be a firefighter or EMT or paramedic with their agency or department, do not just say, it's because I want to save lives and make a difference in the world. Every other applicant is saying those exact words. Instead, why don't you tell them a random fact about the 5 stations that they have in their department, or the amount of water rescues that they did last year, and how you would love nothing more than to be a part of that exact team. And finally,
so I think, like, when I think about this as like interviewing, I think the last thing he just said, I think is true. Like, you should have something specific about that particular place that you can bring up as like something you're interested in, because it shows that you've done like research and you actually know the particulars of the location that you're applying for, or the you know, whatever the company or organization that you're attempting to become part of. So like, I think specifics is good there. The first couple things, I would be a little careful about being too, if someone asks you a question, there is some value in being concise and not going on and on and on and on. Like, it's possible to say, it's possible to talk too much in an interview, 100%. I think a good way to like give off like a sense of confidence is to talk like enough, like answering the question, but make sure you stay on point. I think the most important thing you can do is when you're answering their question, that you're actually answering their question. A lot of times people start talking and then they start talking about things that are not related to the original question, just because they get nervous or they start feeling like they have to fill time. And so they just start kind of rambling. Now, I think it depends on the interview, but yeah, like answering the question is really important. And you can do that concisely. And then you could always ask, like, would you like more detail on a particular part of this? To gauge their feedback, like to get a sense like if they want more from you or not. A good interview should be more of a conversation, I think. Now, if that might not be the case, like it's possible that a lot of people give bad interviews where they're just like asking questions and not engaging in like a conversation. Like to me, I would feel like if I was interviewing someone, I'd want to have more of a back and forth. But it might be that not everyone has that style of interview. So it's possible that they might not want to engage in a back and forth. But yeah, I think there is a fine line between over speaking too much versus being, I think, short to the point but very specific and concrete is like the sweet spot. And then you can open up, like, would you like more on anything I just said? Because I can go into more detail if you would like. Another thing that I think that I've got feedback on from when I was doing interviews that people said was good was when I would ask clarifying questions. So one of the things that I think some people are afraid of doing in an interview because they don't want to come across as like, maybe they don't want to come across as like, I don't know why, but like people are afraid to ask a clarifying question. Like if someone asks you a question and you don't understand it, it's totally fine to be like, did you mean this by that question? Or like, what exactly did you mean by this? Can you clarify? Can you reword that? The reason why it's not a bad thing and can sometimes be actually a good thing is because it shows that you're trying to really understand them. And that's a sign of you engaging honestly in the interview, rather than just trying to answer based on what you think they're asking, because it's likely you give the wrong answer in that case. Yeah, that can be true too. I think so. An interesting way to kind of flip an interview. One way to think about an interview, this is also something that the way you can think about like a date or something is a lot of times when people go on interviews or they go on dates, they feel like they're on the side of having to do the convincing. Like, I have to convince this person to go on a second date with me, or I have to show this person that I have like good qualities. Or when you're in an interview, I have to convince them that I am good for the job or I am worthy. When really you should kind of flip it in a way, and it's okay to like ask questions because you're trying to clarify like if they're good enough for you, right? Like, so if you go into an interview, it's totally fine to have a perspective of like, is this the job for me? And that can be like, that can come across as not being desperate, which desperation can oftentimes be bad. So yeah, asking questions relating to the job, like you're trying to get more information to see if it's a right fit for you, is pretty good too. Ecotourism is on the rise in India. Yeah, I think that's... Oops, this is on over here. That makes sense. I don't know where... Kerala? I've never heard of that state. Okay, so what am I doing here?
It's okay to not get the job. I know it sucks, but it doesn't mean you're stupid. Doesn't mean you're incompetent, that you can't do the job. All it really means is A, you need a little more practice interviewing, or B, there was someone a little more well-suited for the job than you. And it definitely doesn't mean that you should give up. In fact, you should go back to that department. You should ask them what you can do to interview better. You should find the people that interviewed you and get interviewing tips from them. Because I can promise you this, if you go back to that department or agency and bother them and help yourself improve on how to interview and show your face all over that place, the next time interviews come around and you walk in that room, one of those people are going to look at the other person and go, hey, that's the person that came back and asked us how to get better. They're going to remember you. Most likely, you've made that mark and you're probably going to get hired. Well, I hope these tips help you finally snatch up the job of your dreams and you can finally live out all those life-saving fantasies you got running around in your dome. Oh,
How do I get this to go onto the picture-in-picture? Do I just do this? Oh, then it messes that. Doesn't fix it. Has a 96.6% literacy. Okay. Nice.
Sides face off in an ideological battle for the future. In Europe, the Cold War saw two sides face off in an ideological battle for the future. In Europe and North America, the conflict is often discussed as being between NATO and the Warsaw Pact. But NATO predates the Warsaw Pact by 6 years, and during that 6 years something interesting happened. The USSR asked to join, which raises a pretty obvious question: why? Why did the USSR want to join NATO? So, in the 4 years prior to the establishment of NATO, the USSR and the Western powers had a pretty rocky relationship. The West was extremely concerned with the Red Army, given that it was absolutely massive, and there were worries in Washington that the USSR may start conquering territory piecemeal and pick off the Western countries one by one. As such, the Western powers founded NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, to protect themselves from any potential threats in the future. Now, officially, this was a simple defensive alliance that anyone in Europe could be a member of, and wasn't aimed specifically at any one nation. Unofficially, though, it was the Communists' a scary club. Now, the Soviets weren't silly, and its leadership was at this point filled with pretty shrewd diplomats who knew what NATO really was. And when Stalin opted to follow in Lenin's footsteps and die, there was a chance for the USSR's foreign policy to pivot. Two people important to this were Lavrenti Beria and Vyacheslav
All right, sounds good,
Molotov,
Mr. Chang. Good luck with your studying.
idea. Let's make friends with the West. This plan involved several steps. The first was the reunification of Germany on the condition that it become a perpetually neutral state. In return for what was essentially the USSR giving up East Germany, the leaders of which were not consulted, the Soviet Union wanted to join the new European defence community, which, as the name suggests, didn't include any non-Europeans. Obviously, the Western powers would never go along with this, and so when it was rejected, to make it look like they were conceding something, the Soviets offered to join NATO. This offer was semi-serious in that the Soviet leadership expected it to be rejected, but had prepared for the eventuality that the Western leadership would get very drunk or something and say yes. So why did they apply to join? Well, the answer is simple. It was a win-win. If the Western powers rejected Soviet membership, then they were admitting that NATO was in fact an anti-Soviet bloc, which would in turn allow the USSR to build its own alliance and give it much greater free rein in its foreign policy. If the Western powers accepted Soviet membership, then NATO's character as an anti-Soviet alliance would change into a general European defensive one. And also, Germany would stay forever disarmed, which given recent events was something that the USSR very much wanted. As you'll be aware, the answer from the West was a no, not for want of Churchill trying, and the no was for the exact same reasons that the USSR wanted to join. However, they weren't so open about the exact reason why and cited the USSR's non-democratic government and occupation of Eastern European nations for the negative response. And so the USSR was now free to act in retaliation and did so by forming its own alliance in 1955, and thus the Warsaw Pact was born. I hope you enjoyed this episode and thank you for watching, with a special thanks to my patrons James Bizanet, Kelly Moneymaker, Rob Waterhouse.
So that was a longer video. Could be a biased video, I think, because it's from the EU.
A quick thank you to everyone who's watching this channel in 2021. So if you're not subscribed, hit the button to get more from us in 2022 and beyond. As we discussed in two recent videos, Russia has ratcheted up tensions between themselves and neighbouring Ukraine, with some worried about how far Russia would go in reclaiming so-called Nova Russia, or New Russia. So in this video, we're going to be taking yet another look at the ongoing conflict on the Russo-Ukrainian border and suggesting that the West should do more to help Ukraine. We should be clear about what we mean when we say the West should do more to help Ukraine. We're aware that this sounds suspiciously opinionated for a nominally impartial channel, but the main thesis of this video is going to be that it's in the West's self-interest to do more in Ukraine, largely because a stable compromise that maintains the status quo is impossible. We're not trying to be anti-Russia or anything like that. We're just pointing out that, assuming that the West isn't happy for Ukraine to become a Russian satellite state,
Matt.
then evidence
Evening
suggests
to you as well.
It needs to do more. Anyway, let's get into it. A good way of understanding this conflict is by considering Ukraine as torn between two possible futures, which we might call the European future and the Eurasian future. Either Ukraine sorts out its corruption problems and becomes a modern European state, possibly an EU member, the European future, or it ends up more allied with Russia, most likely as some sort of Russian satellite state, the Eurasian future. In the 2010s, Ukraine was torn between these two outcomes. Since 2007, Ukraine and the EU had been negotiating an association agreement. At the core of the proposed pact was a deep and comprehensive free trade agreement, which would eliminate most tariffs on trade in goods. At the same time, Russia was trying to get Ukraine to join its own integration project, the Eurasian Economic Union, which would include a customs union. These two offers were mutually exclusive. Ukraine couldn't both have an association agreement with the EU and be part of the EAEU. Originally, Ukraine looked likely to sign the association agreement, but in November 2013, then President Viktor Yanukovych suddenly announced he was scrapping the deal. While Yanukovych didn't explicitly commit to the EAEU, he'd just received a $15 billion loan from Russia, and his shunning of the EU's proposed association agreement was widely perceived as a precursor to some sort of Eurasian tilt. At the same time, it looked like Russia had beaten the EU to the punch, but Yanukovych's about-face provoked fury in Kiev, sparking the massive Euromaidan protests. In February 2014, the protests forced Yanukovych to flee from Kiev to, you guessed it, Russia. Russia's subsequent illegal annexation of Crimea and the attempted occupation of Donbass, all part of his Novorossiya policy, can be seen as a response to this setback. Putin saw Ukraine swinging away from its Russia towards the EU and realised he needed to do something if he wanted to ensure Ukraine's Eurasian future. Now, while it might not seem like it today, what happened in 2014 was actually a foreign policy disaster for Putin. While Russia had some success in Crimea, they faced far more resistance than expected in Donbass and failed to successfully occupy Luhansk or Donetsk. Furthermore, Russian aggression did nothing to slow Ukraine's European integration. Western countries, wary of Russia's destabilizing influence, began to provide arms to Ukraine, who started pushing back the Russian-backed separationists, and, in May 2014, the Ukrainian electorate elected the more Western-leaning Petro Poroshenko, who signed the EU's association agreement. The point is that in 2014, Ukraine was moving towards its European future, and Putin apparently couldn't do anything to stop it. With Ukraine tilting ever more towards the European future, Russia was forced into more and more aggressive actions. In September 2014, after Ukrainian forces started making progress against the Russian-backed separationists, Putin sent about 6,500 Russian troops to Donetsk, where they overwhelmed Ukrainian forces at Ilovaisk. And this is where Putin had his first success. With the threat of more violence looming, Ukraine and Russia signed the Minsk Agreement, otherwise known as Minsk I. This is important because it was the first time Putin successfully pushed Ukraine away from the European future and a bit closer to the Eurasian future. Desperate to avoid further violence, Ukraine agreed to give separationist-occupied Donbass
What's the difference though, Matt?
special status for 3 years in exchange for it.
So you say like it's Putin and not Russia. I think I could imagine someone arguing that, well, Putin is Russia at this point. Is there a Russia? Is there a different? So oftentimes, and this is kind of a weird thing, we say like a country does this and a country is doing this or that, but it's also kind of it's weird because the country is more than just, it's not like everyone in the country is agreeing with it, right? Like we use this term, the country. It'd be like saying like the United States, you know, has given aid to Ukraine. Did the United States do it? Yeah, as an entity, but not everyone in the country made that decision necessarily. So it is a weird way to phrase it, but typically we do that. Let's do this.
for a ceasefire. Minsk I gave the Russian-backed Donetsk People's Republic, or DNR, and Luhansk People's Republic, or LNR, rights to establish their own police forces, to appoint judges and prosecutors, and to pursue language self-determination. Essentially, Minsk I gave pro-Russian forces their own mini-state within Ukraine. No ceasefire was achieved, and in February 2015, fighting intensified, and Russian forces took the strategically important transport hub of Debaltseve. This time, France and Germany negotiated Minsk II, which gave Donbass even more so-called special status in exchange for the promise of a ceasefire. This time, Donbass's special status would be permanently enshrined in a new Ukrainian constitution, with their own militias and financial support from the Ukrainian central government. Minsk II was never implemented because it was ambiguous about sequencing. Russia said it wanted special status for Donbass before the withdrawal of Russian troops, while Ukraine said there wouldn't be any special status until Russian withdrawal. Now, the Minsk agreements are important for 3 reasons. First, they mark the 2 occasions that Putin twice successfully pushed Ukraine towards the Eurasian future, both times using the threat of violence. This partly explains the current aggression. So far, it's been the only thing that's worked for Putin. Second, they restrict any future compromises, because Russia won't accept anything less than Minsk II, and Europe can't be seen to be violating a treaty they signed up to in the first place. Minsk II already pushes Ukraine towards the Eurasian future for 3 reasons. First, Minsk II provides for a pro-Russian mini-state within Ukraine, with the constitutional power to limit any European tilt. Second, Minsk II erodes the notion of Ukrainian sovereignty. I mean, it literally says that the pro-Russian forces in Donbass can have its own army, and legitimizes Russian interference in Ukrainian constitutional affairs. Third, Minsk II guarantees political instability in Ukraine. It far exceeds what most Ukrainians consider an acceptable price for peace. Polling from the Atlantic Council found that only 15% of Ukrainians accept the conditions in Minsk II, which is why Zelensky has so far refused to accept it. Its implementation would be political suicide and guarantee political instability in Ukraine, which would probably end up facilitating Russia's eventual occupation of the region. And finally, we come to the thesis of this video. If we accept these 2 premises, number 1, that any future compromises will have to be consistent with Minsk II, and 2, Minsk II entails the Eurasian future for Ukraine, then for anyone who doesn't want Ukraine to end up with the Eurasian future, and presumably that includes the West, a post-Minsk compromise isn't an option. Western leaders who advocate for a compromise often assume that there's some sort of middle ground that can maintain the status quo, keep Ukraine somewhere between the European and Eurasian futures, where the West doesn't have to put in the legwork guiding it into a functioning democracy, but it doesn't become a Russian satellite state. But this is impossible because, as we've hopefully shown, any Minsk-consistent compromise will actively push Ukraine towards the Eurasian future. So, what should the West do? Well, broadly, there are 2 options. If it wants to guarantee Ukraine its European future, it needs to do more than just sanctions, which have so far proved ineffective against Putin. Essentially, it'll need to prove to Ukrainians that the West are better allies than Russia, and help transform Ukraine from a relatively dysfunctional, corrupt-ridden autocracy to something approaching a modern European democracy. This would make Russian annexation of even Donbass untenable, but would require a prolonged standoff with Russia. Now, obviously, this would be no easy task. It would require money, military support, and the risk of future conflict, something the West have been remarkably averse to. But it might not be as hard as it sounds. After all, wars are expensive, and Russia today has a GDP of just $1.5 trillion. For context, that's about 20% less than Italy. Public support in Ukraine is also swinging towards Europe. A 2017 poll by Rating Group Ukraine found that 57% of Ukrainians polled expressed a very cold or cold attitude towards Russia, as opposed to only 17% who expressed a very warm or warm attitude. Europe's other option is to decide that it's just not worth it, and well, there's an argument for that. After all, it would be expensive, and a prolonged standoff with Russia could risk a nuclear war. You might not think it's worth risking the end of the world for Donbass, and fair enough. The point that we're trying to make, though, is that there isn't really a middle way here, or at least we can't see how a post-Minsk compromise will do anything but gift Ukraine to Russia. If the West wants Ukraine to have a European future, it needs to do more. If it doesn't want to do more, fair enough, but then the West has to accept that a Eurasian future for Ukraine is the most likely outcome. But anyway, what do you think? Should the West do more, or is it just not worth it? Or perhaps we're missing something. It's very possible, after all, we're just a YouTube channel. Maybe you can see some sort of viable compromise. Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Also, be sure to subscribe to the channel and hit the bell icon to be notified every time we release a new video.
Did Pepsi really own the 6th largest navy in the world? Did Pepsi really own the 6th largest navy in the world? It's a documentary?
There's a common rumour that does the rounds on the internet that at one point PepsiCo was given a bunch of ships by the USSR, and as a result of this transaction it's often stated to have owned the 6th largest navy in the world at that point, which obviously raises the question, did it? Well, to begin, the story often deviates on when PepsiCo came into ownership of this navy. Some versions say that it was after the Second World War, and some say it was in the 60s and others the 80s, with the last one being correct since the transaction occurred in 1989. So what was this transaction? So Pepsi wanted to continue selling its drinks to the very large internal market of the USSR, yet there was a snag. The Soviet ruble was a closed currency, meaning that outside of the USSR it was basically worthless. It couldn't be traded for dollars, which meant that foreign companies couldn't take their profits out of the country. To counteract this, Pepsi made a deal in the 1970s with a Soviet vodka company. This meant that some of the profits from the sale of that vodka globally would be used to reimburse Pepsi for its sales in the USSR. As time went on though, Pepsi was starting to lose money, and so it renegotiated. And this is where the ships come in. Pepsi made a deal with the Soviet government, and it was reported in the USA that in return for the continued sale of Pepsi there, the USSR would instead pay with decommissioned naval vessels, which would then be sailed to India and then sold for scrap to reimburse the company. Some news outlets reported that the deal had secured Pepsi 17 submarines, a frigate, a destroyer and a cruiser. Would this have been the 6th largest navy in the world though? Well, no, not even close. It wasn't even in the top 30, but for a private company that would have been a fairly impressive navy. There's also one other problem in that it never happened. The sale of these warships for scrap was an idea floated by the Soviet government.
Wait, is this a video about something that never happened?
Every ship in the Soviet Navy which was scrapped during this period is accounted for, and in fact the deal saw the USSR build freight ships for Pepsi, which could then sell or lease them out as it saw fit. And so, sorry to disappoint you all, but Pepsi never owned a navy, and even if it had, it wasn't a very large one. For what it's worth though, the deal was finalised in 1990, and it remained in effect for 18 months before the USSR collapsed and Pepsi had to start negotiations all over again. I hope you enjoyed this episode and thank you for watching, with a special thanks to my patrons James Bisonet, Kelly Moneymaker, Anthony Beckett, The Pastry Section, Danny Maloney, Rob Waterhouse, Mo, Aaron the White, James Cast.
I didn't even know about that as like a thing. I didn't realize that people thought that Pepsi owned the 6th largest navy in the world. And so the fact that I just watched the video that told me that something I didn't even know wasn't true is interesting. all this stuff. No, it's okay, Rishiraj. I appreciate it. I like I like learning about things. Meditation's impact on the brain. I wonder if this is something that I may have seen before. Oh, like this little clip that has a what looks like a person from like a Buddhist, like maybe a monk of some kind.
Science has contributed to our understanding of the effects of meditation on the brain and body.
The research that we've done on meditation in the brain has focused on two major domains that meditation actually affects. One is attention, and the other is emotion. And what we have discovered is that the circuits in the brain that are important for regulating both attention and emotion can be transformed by meditation. The 30,000-foot goal is to use the scientific research to understand the nature of suffering and how it can best be alleviated. And Mingyur Rinpoche was one of our first long-term practitioners.
This will be strapped onto the arm, and we'll get your ratings of how...
That's normal, without meditation?
Yes. Yes, without meditation.
Usually when you do this kind of research with either brain electrical measurements or MRI, it takes a lot of what we call post-processing to look at the data. And what post-processing means is simply lots of computer algorithms churning at the data after the data is collected. And it often takes many, many days of computer processing to extract these really weak signals in a lot of noise. It's finding a needle in a haystack. With Mingyur Rinpoche, we didn't need any fancy post-processing. We actually were able to see a signal with our naked eye. Of course, the first thing we thought is that there's artifact and there's something wrong because this just is not something that we typically would see. And so then we had to go through the entire recording system and take everything apart and put it back together before we convinced ourselves that this is actually real. Then when we discovered that it was real, it was really quite amazing because nobody had ever seen these kinds of signals before for this length of time. And what we were looking at are gamma oscillations in the brain. They're very fast frequency brain oscillations, and they're seen in any ordinary person, but they're seen for very, very short periods of time, typically less than 1 second. They also don't have such large amplitude. And when Mingyur Rinpoche was meditating, these signals were large, they were highly synchronized, and they lasted for many, many minutes. They lasted for the entire time that the meditation session was in progress. And that's what made them very visible. So that was really a very important moment because we knew that from a scientific perspective, there was a there there. We can see that a person who meditates for even just 2 weeks, 30 minutes a day, shows a different pattern of brain activity than when they started 2 weeks before. And that is really important because it suggests that the brain really is plastic, that we really can make these changes, and that it actually doesn't take that much. A total of 7 hours of practice was sufficient to change the brain in very objective, measurable ways. Well-being and warm-heartedness can be cultivated. We can think of them almost as skills, which can be enhanced through certain kinds of practice.
I think I've heard of those kinds of things before. Do you meditate much? I feel like I used to meditate a lot more than I do now. I think there was like a period of my life where I went through like trying to meditate about 10 to 20 minutes in the morning, and then I tried to do the same at night, and maybe did that for a while, like maybe a year. Okay, right. Nice. 10 minutes every day after school is pretty good. I like how consistent you are. Why is this thing? Okay, at this point, I don't even know where I'm going in this game anymore. I think I just have to, like, sort of rework this whole thing. Get everything organized. What I should also be doing is Shoot, I'm not able to connect this. Okay, Mark 3s. Hey, let's see. I'm gonna hook this up over here. Put this here. All right. I think I'm gonna call it a night though. So I will see you later. Thanks for the vids, Reese Raz. Interesting. But I'm gonna call it a night. Have a good one.